Okay, everyone can hear me better. Thank you. Sorry about that. Not enough coffee, I guess. All right, so just to review quickly the process that we talked about yesterday, just to make sure we're all on the same page. We've gone through the collaborative engagement, which were the outreach announcement letters, the online survey. Hopefully we'll get more respondents. The restoration actions, we have the best management practices and what we're going to do with them. Teleconferences with regions and the Park Service, and I'm been asked by the BLM as well to do a regional conference. Very happy to do that. So we're at the National Summit, and after the summit there will be a call, and I'll give you the timeline in just a moment, for nominated areas. Then we talked about a teleconference core area workshop. Again, we'll give you the timeline, assembling data, the narrative, the draft restoration plan report, and actually building the National Whitebark Pine Restoration Plan. I don't know if I gave an earlier draft on this. I apologize for the lack of formatting there. Here's the timeline process here. So here we are at the summit, November 2017. And the call for core area information is going to go out probably in early December, certainly before the holidays. And this letter will be detailed as to what we want. And we're giving you all a very long heads up. Let me point out that the target deadline for this information is late April. All right, so we had promised originally at least a 2 months heads up in the survey, and we're giving you more than that. So late April, we'd like to get the vast majority of the nominated core area information. But we also know that there's going to be some coordination needs on your part, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. So it means that fairly quickly after the holidays, and I know we're bumping up against them, which is a bit problematic for all of us, that conversations have got to begin within your jurisdictions. All right, so we have the field season of 2018, and we have people indicating that they might be able to fill some information gaps. So that's going to take a little bit of planning, and for everyone here, particularly the higher level managers, please be cognizant of needs, and it would be wonderful if some of these needs could be fulfilled with resources. So that's my plea, if that's possible at all, in order to fill some of those gaps. And then late September, early October, that's kind of the last point in time that we can accept data for this, and hopefully if you have filled those gaps over the summer, we need that information. You need to provide the follow-up information for us. And then the draft plan, mid to late December 2018 is our timeline for getting that together. And the cautionary message is anything could happen. We don't know what the bumps are in the road in assembling this, so have some patience. We'll be working hard on this, and this is probably a bit fluid. All right, the components to the plan. So the nominated core areas from each jurisdiction, and I will talk a little bit more about the details involved in that in just a moment. And then within these core areas, we'd really like a priority 1. This is our first priority. This is where the resources are going to go first. And then when that's done, the second priority, and then third. So one thing that's going to come up is the question of scale. So your nominated core areas are going to be on a much larger scale than restoration is done. Restoration is at a stand level scale. And you're going to nominate areas, and we all need to think about this. You're not going to be able to do wall-to-wall restoration within the nominated areas because restoration is pretty much at a stand level scale, or if you're planting, it's in a burn. But we realize that wall-to-wall is not necessarily possible or will be achieved. You'll fill in over time, basically. We need, along with the data on the GIS, the mapping, and the nominated core areas, we need to know the criteria used to identify those areas for our narrative. So we understand why those areas have been nominated. And hopefully you'll integrate what you know about health and whitebark pine successional community status in these areas, and propose restoration actions, and you will tell us the restoration actions that you think right now need to be done in these areas. And we will have implementation costs. In fact, Ellen Youngt is going to be presenting those in just a little bit today. But you guys may need to estimate, if you can't get figures at this point in time based on just our broad implementation costs. What we would like to do is help you with that. So we would like to price out what you're proposing to do and the where you're proposing to do that. And then as we will talk about a little later today, there needs to be a monitoring and an adaptive management strategy connected with your restoration action. It does not need to be highly specific, but you do need to talk about visiting your restoration and assessing its success and a timeline on that, because restoration is not a one-off, as we all know, we are also working in geographic areas now with this restoration plan that we haven't done perhaps a lot of restoration before, and it's a learning process. Okay, so administrative level for data, and in all honesty, we've been sorting this out furiously over the last 24 hours here. So the unit level is going to actually provide the nominated data. And we have put our heads together, Eric Sprague, Bob Keane and I and others, and we're going to push the envelope a little. Okay, we want a judicious inclusion of wilderness and hedge your bets in that we know that this is new territory and we're feeling our way. So you need to also have a judicious inclusion of non-wilderness where you know you can do restoration. Okay. And in terms of restoration action in wilderness, there are some light things that can be done, and we've all had conversations within the last couple of days on this idea of sowing seeds. I guess we're not going to call it direct seeding anymore. It has negative connotations of just dumping seeds out there. Of sowing seeds, there are light things to do that are not as intrusive, and talking to other wilderness folks, that's been given a pass by many. So we can talk about that. All right, so in terms of the administrative level for providing data, within U.S. Forest Service regions, we're interested in core proposals at the national forest level and wilderness level, specific wilderness area level. And for the Park Service, it would be at the national park level. Parks are widely distributed for the most part in space, perhaps with the exception of Yellowstone and Grand Teton. And they deal with different conditions, and it would be at the park level that we would hope to get the nominations. But I'm going to talk about coordination in just a moment on criteria. BLM, it could be the field office level, including their own wilderness if they have some whitebark in it. It could be at the state level. We're open and we need feedback, and we'll try to sort this out at our conference call, our teleconference call. Tribal lands, it's at the tribe level, of course. State lands at the state level. So we have decided that it would be useful to coordinate prioritize criteria for identifying your core areas. And at the Forest Service jurisdiction, this coordination should really be at the regional level, and there may be some dialogue with the Washington office as well as this is happening. But I think at the regional level, it would be very useful to identify the list of criteria that are to be recommended. And there hopefully will be several criteria, and each national forest can emphasize those that are most relevant. At NPS, and we had a wonderful impromptu discussion last night with a number of folks here from the Park Service. This could be at the network level, this kind of coordination of criteria use. So this would be at the I&M monitoring network level. And this remains to be discussed a bit further, and have some dialogue and talk about this and interact with us and let us know what you're thinking. BLM, this could be at the state level, coordination in terms of the criteria that would be used across that state. And if you want to coordinate even among states, again, we need to leave that up to the managers to make that decision. But we do recommend that you have this dialogue with your managers at higher levels than the field office. Tribal lands, at the tribe level, unless there's a desire to dialogue and develop some shared criteria. All right, so the data requested from each unit, again, the GIS layer of whitebark pine distribution, because we would like to know where whitebark pine is and what you know about it. And most of our distribution maps are incomplete. They're based, for example, the one that we've shown you, it's based on potential whitebark pine, not necessarily ground truth to have whitebark pine there. So one byproduct of this effort will, if anything, help us firm up our knowledge of where whitebark pine is. So any spatial data that you have, plot data, anything where you know for sure you have whitebark, that's very important to us. So we're saying to nominate 20 to 30% of the area of the unit, and the unit being the National Forest, the National Park. The BLM will sort that out, but perhaps the field office jurisdiction or the state for restoration. And then we need the criteria used for all portions of the nominated area, and if they differ spatially, we'd like to know the mapping associated with that criteria. And the prioritized area will be delineated by priority 1, 2, and 3. We're also very interested on your data on the health status at the smallest scale possible. So that would be very beneficial. And these will all go into layers, GIS layers of whitebark pine health status. You need to determine which restoration actions are required for these nominated areas. And then a monitoring and adaptive management strategy for each restoration project, or if you're doing a number of the same kinds of projects, one strategy, monitoring strategy might cover all of these if they are pretty much the same. That would work well. Okay. So I'm going to pass this on now to Bob, who wanted his own title slide, and that's because we're switching gears a little bit now. In other words, what's going to happen to these data?
You want to take questions now, or you want to finish?
Well, we could both stand up here afterwards and take questions.
Okay, as I mentioned yesterday, the data that will reside, that we'll be managing for the whole project will consist of spatial data or maps, digital maps, and then somebody told me that I should have made that a black box, not a red box, but modeling statistical analysis and programs. And then the non-spatial data, which of course plot, stand, and point data that we'll get. And so what will happen is the existing data will come in, both field data and the spatial data will go into the red box, and out will pop out these model spatial data and model plot data. At this point, I want to tell you that there are two ways data will make it into this system that we'll manage. One way is you people, and you people are going to be given this data to Julie. Will you please stand up? To Julie. Julie is the main collector of all the data that's going to come up from below, and she is going to coordinate it and consolidate it and then summarize it so that it'll go into our system. The other thing, thank you, Julie. The other part of the thing is to go out and collect all existing data that already exists out there from sources like FIA and so on, and that will be done by Lisa Holsinger. Lisa, will you stand up? And Lisa Holsinger is the black box. She is the middle of that. She is the main person that will be collecting the data that I'll be talking about in a minute, and she will be, if you have ideas, you can either talk to myself or Lisa, and she will be the one that will not only be doing the collection of the existing data, but the complex statistical analysis in the middle. Okay, that is weird. Okay, as I said, the data that's going to come up from below the Julie data will be, of course, individual collections, and it won't be wall-to-wall. But in the end, the data that we'll be using for a lot of the analysis has to be wall-to-wall. And it has to be done so that we're not mapping some area and using one method and another area using another set of methods and so on. So it's going to take some very creative thought to piece together everything that will be that we can get in the range of whitebark pine. Note that this particular map shows just the US, but we are, as I said yesterday, we will definitely put in Canada as much as we can. Again, the map resolutions will come in at various sizes from 30 meters all the way up to 1 kilometer. And then we'll probably, when we do the top-down evaluations or prioritizations, we'll probably do it at the 6-code Huck level and not go below that. And hopefully that all the stuff that comes up below the Julie data will all be able to be summarized to that 6-code Huck. And then from the 6-code Huck, we'll summarize up to the district's forest and upwards if that is needed in the future. Okay, let's talk about existing data. One of I call them the big six, you could call it whatever, but there are 6 data layers that we absolutely need to do this process. It is where the potential for whitebark pine exists, where whitebark pine exists now, the successional status, or in other words, what are the plants that are in whitebark potential, are they late successional species and so on. The third one is mountain pine beetle, mortality and infection, then blister rust. Is that 6? That's 5. Oh, and then fire, the MTBS data. So those top 6 are the ones that we are going to concentrate and make sure that we have wall-to-wall for all of you to use. This time, I also want to tell you that there are 3 reasons why we're compiling this database. One is for you to use later on, right? In your, it'll exist. The Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation has agreed to host it. It'll exist out there, and it will hopefully help you set context into your analyses that you do at the individual districts and forests or whatever. The second reason is that when we get the prioritizations or the selection, there will be many forests that will not have submitted stuff and the many areas that won't. And so we need to be able to, have some way to fit in or decide on areas that are really important, but nobody was there to do the prioritization. And the third thing, of course, is for us, or for the Washington office or above, to be able to put all of your selected landscapes into the context of why these are really important to restore. And so those are the three reasons we're actually going to put these data layers together. So here's some examples of some existing. I mentioned the top 6. So it's possible we'll evaluate land fire, their EVT map to see if that'll will suffice for successional stage, and we'll recode the land fire so that it'll actually make sense. Then we'll hopefully we'll use the Steve Brown maps. We'll do a patchwork of a bunch of other maps to look at both potential and actual, like the Steve Brown map and so on. We'll also integrate all the existing range maps that are out there, and then the species distribution models that use today's climate are actually very good. There's about 6 different species distribution model out there, and from all of these things we'll come up with potential and actual whitebark pine and the successional status. For fire, of course, we're going to use the MTBS, but MTBS, for those of you who don't know, MTBS is our fire atlas for fire. It is a map of fire perimeters with fire severity inside, and so we should have, Lisa has access to most of the MTBS back to 1984, and so we'll be able to integrate that in for you at 30 meters. The beetle layer we're going to actually steal and rob from FHP, and hopefully we can put that layer in some way that we can use it for you people. And then the rust layer is one we're going to have to actually develop. The one that we developed way back in 2000, was it 8 or 9, is at, it uses only like 200 plots to do a kind of a species distributional model approach to mapping rust infection across the range. So we're going to actually redo that layer using the black box approach and try to get at rust infection and mortality rates across the range. And then ownership, roads and trails, and topography, of course, are all out there. And we may not host it, but we'll have the links to actually go out and get it from the Whitebark Pine Foundation website. Existing data is, there are 2 forms, again, is that they're the data that you are going to give us, both at the stand level, the plot level, or whatever, and hopefully, but also there are a bunch of existing data out there, and of course, the big 2 are the Willis database and FIA. And Willis database, right now, I met with Greg Donetto last month, and it looks like we're going to take the Willis database and input all the plot data that we have into the what is now called the high 5, right, Sandy? Or I think it. Thank you. Thanks, Blakey. All right, yeah. So it's now called the high 5, and we'll take it and integrate it all in, coordinate with Fort Collins, and make sure we get all the latest in there. And then it will reside as a Rocky Mountain Research Station archive on our website that will be updated every year. And so that's Greg and I's idea. If there is other opportunities to take the Willis and actually make, Greg Donetto's, or I guess whoever developed it, the original dream was to have the data be entered on the fly. But that probably won't happen because of the data security measures. Correct me if I'm wrong, the FAP folks. So right now, Willis is going to be probably the benchmark database that we'll use to develop most of the rust maps and so on. So, and then of course, Lisa has connections that we can actually get at the FIA locations, and we'll be able to use the FIA data as well as the Willis to do a lot of those black box stuff that we just talked about. Anything that comes in has to meet some QA/QC standards that we have in the Forest Service, and then everything will be stored in ANSI ASCII for availability, and you can bring them in any text editor, including Word, to look at them and use them and so on. So they'll all be available, and hopefully we'll compile something that everybody can use. Here's the databases that we're looking at: FHP, the Willis, the High 5. The FIA, stand inventories, research plots, any data from the field we'll accept. And if the data from the field fit the high 5 format, we'll integrate that in for you into that database. And if it doesn't fit, we'll keep it as a separate database and just save that information. So here is an example of the model. This is the whitebark pine blister rust infection rate that we did way back almost 10 years ago with only 200 plots. And it was amazing that this even got, I think it was a 55% accuracy, but it was the only thing we had at the time, so we had to use it. But you know, we're going to redo this one, and we're going to use not only climate and so on, but also topography and whatever we can to make sure that it's one of the better ones. I'll also add that some of the model spatial data that will serve will also be some of the climate data, the gridded climate for future and for present that we will use, and then we'll have it available for you to use, hopefully. And then, of course, the plot data, sometimes we need to calculate other things in order to do it. And so, for instance, you know, it's often a model to actually calculate percent rust infection is kind of a model thing, because some people include the saplings, some people include the seedlings, and so on. And so you have to use a kind of a model-based approach to get at some of the attributes that we're actually going to sample and so on. So this is what I mean by model plot data. And then there's the EMDS, which it may be useful for you, but it will more or less be more useful at the national level, but we'll have it for you to use at the district or forest level. And for those of you who don't know, EMDS was developed by Keith Reynolds. It's called Ecosystem Management Decision Support System. And it basically takes all the data that you have, and there's two engines in it. One is a logic engine, which allows you to go to say things like, this particular data layer takes precedence over that one. And the other one is a prioritization engine, which says that I want you to give this amount of weight to this decision, or this amount of emphasis for this particular criteria. And so all of those data get in there, and they get summarized spatially, which is really nice. And so here's an example of what happens. That comes out is that if you do it for a region, you get multiple prioritizations that you can do, and this is usually what happens is that there's sometimes 20 or 30 different prioritizations, and one particular landscape always gets lit up. And so for the northern region, you can see here are the 6 code watersheds, and you can see some of them. This was rated for, I think this was out of, I stole this from IRPS, the thing. This was from Whitebark, I think, for priority. Or it could be. Anyways, so you can see that it lights up red based on all the criteria that was used to represent it. Along with this, which I think is more important, the maps are cool, but they're really not useful for working with, but it gives you a list of watersheds that, and you know, from the top to the bottom based on their score, and we use that constantly. And with that, I guess you can, Diane and I will take questions. Yeah.
So I'm having a hard time reconciling the timeline with the database that you're just talking about. So you guys are doing a core area nomination call for late April. So are you collecting all of this data in advance of that so we can use
I think I need to clarify, because I was sitting there thinking, listening. Sorry. Let me try to clarify. While everyone is prioritizing, dialoguing, working out what their nominations are, we're actually going to create layers independently. And these layers actually, for those jurisdictions that don't have a lot of data, can actually be used to guide. And I think we need to clarify this. So we can independently create some data layers on health, like blister rust, for example, distribution, et cetera, because we know that the knowledge of where whitebark pine is not uniform across jurisdictions. And so a good question, and we haven't really come to grips with this. We're going to take the opportunity Thursday afternoon to sit down and talk in a lot more detail ourselves, because we've all been kind of working this out. This is new ground. So Bob's going to create, with the help of his folks, some data layers. And we know that there are gaps in information, and we are happy once the data layers are created to actually share this with some jurisdictions that may not have all this information. Okay.
Also, Reagan, is that there are existing data layers right now that we can post right now that will be useful, right? They will be replaced as we get new, better and better stuff. So you may have access to the old data for a while, and then the new data will be replacing.
And as I said, one really incredible byproduct of this whole process is going to be, as the data actually come in, being more, really making a distribution map that's more accurate, improving the accuracy of our knowledge, and also of our health knowledge. Because there's information out there, they're in filing cabinets or on computers that haven't been generally available, and that we would have the opportunity to compile and maybe become a little bit more accurate in terms of blister rust and successional advancement in the loss of whitebark pine, and that will be, these are important products that will come of this as well. So there's the ultimate product, which is the range map of whitebark pine that has these prioritized core areas on them that we want to target for priority 1, 2, and 3. But there's these accessory products that are going to come out of it as well, including improving the distribution map, and knowing better where our health challenges are across the range of whitebark pine. And some of this will have to be predictive, of course, where we don't have a lot of information. So
one more clarifying question, sorry. So you're going to do an initial call for plot data and those types of things to precede the call for the nominated area?
no, we're just going to do a call for the nominated areas. In the meantime, while we're waiting for it, I think, is that
Right, yeah, right. Is that it'll be simultaneous, but the call for the nominated areas takes precedence over any data, right? But we'll tell you that if you have data for your area, it's good to get it in there, because then it won't appear as a black area on any of the maps in the future.
I know Bob said there will be forests that won't contribute. Please, let's not let that happen. I was a little concerned. We all need to rally the troops, and we all need to network and help colleagues that might not be up on the whitebark pine issue or couldn't be here at the summit to help them comply. Because as Bob said, if we don't have compliance with some jurisdictions or units, we're going to have to do it ourselves. We'll do the nomination based on these layers that are generated, but we'd rather it be grassroots. We'd rather that it be ground up, because there's going to be some coordination, we hope, on progress on this restoration plan at a higher level. And we really do want to see this kind of progress. Is there any other? Yeah, Andy.
Two questions. First one for you, since you've got the microphone. So for nominating the core areas, you gave the units, for the Forest Service, the Park Service, and various land management agencies. I know that in Oregon and Washington, a lot of times, like, the parks are almost completely or nearly completely surrounded by national forest, or the few BLM or state lands are immediately adjacent to national forest lands. So would it be preferable to work across boundaries and coordinate together?
Yeah.
Different management objectives, so the priorities may be different also.
And the priorities may be different, but on the other hand, they may be more similar than you'd think. And this is what we need to discover this fairly early on. So Melissa might mention this, because the GYA has been a wonderful example of coordination among jurisdictions. And we ideally would like some coordination, but we're going to have to leave it up to you, to everybody, because we don't want to, I think for a lot of people, we totally understand how you are pulled in many directions in terms of your work obligations, and we know that this is kind of off the top or on the side. We totally get this, and we don't want to make this too onerous. We don't want to put too many please do this, please do that. This may be difficult enough as it is, and we don't want to discourage compliance. But on the other hand, if you are sharing a watershed, for example, and you have someone who can do this for you, and I know in the Forest Service, each region has a coordinator who has been nominated by the regional forester to coordinate with this effort. That's a great level to start talking to the Park Service and discussing perhaps some shared priorities. Okay, there should be some responsibility for helping everybody in the regional offices of the Forest Service, and perhaps we could find a parallel with the Park Service as well and with the BLM. So there is some higher level coordination to make it easier for the field offices who are actually working with whitebark pine to make these decisions. But we don't want to have too many thou shalts in this. Okay, so, but you're right. We need to think about this. Rob, yeah.
So I'd like to put a sharper point on Andy's comment, because I think it's critical. We want to allow, I think, for local flexibility, but there's also a lot to be gained by harmonization. And so if you envision two circles with the Venn diagram of overlap, the more that is in the, I would never turn down a microphone. The more that's in the circle of harmonization, I think the better off we all are. And for example, to have opportunities for interregional discussions within an agency, because critical question, do you go after the areas that have 90% mortality, or do you focus on the areas that have 20% mortality? And if you're sharing a watershed and your neighbor across the ridge is focusing on the opposite of you, then you have what we called in the invasive plant business the donut hole. And so the more harmonization that can occur within this process with a limited time frame, the better.
Thanks, Rob. But I have to admit I'm a person, and Melissa's going to talk about criteria in just a moment, so, and I certainly don't want to steal her thunder, but I also believe a bit in bed hedging, and that it may not be the worst thing to have some slightly different criteria, so that's something to think about as well in terms of what you're targeting. Because at this point in time, there's a lot of unknowns in terms of ultimate successes, of course. So it's just a thought too. And one thing that we've talked about in the best management practices is proactive restoration. The idea that you should be considering the healthy or the healthier whitebark as well as the unhealthy. But Rob makes a good point about the coordination and being on the same page, and maybe how things can, in fact, get allocated with the different jurisdictions as well. So, okay. Melissa, yeah.
Data layers are going to be put together after, we're going to get those after we do our core area prioritization. And
yeah, well,
so we won't have them to do our core area prioritization.
Not off the bat, you won't, but.
So the question one is then, once we get that information, would we be able to change our prioritization? Could we allow some flexibility in there if we get these maps and go, wow, we didn't know that before now, so this changes everything. And then, so I'd like to put a plug into that, if we can, the timeline. And then my other question is, this EMDS black box thing, it's going to come out with priorities. What happens if those priorities don't match up at all with the ones that we came up with? Is that a problem?
No, not at all. No, your priorities are above all the most important, right? It's just that what we're looking for or what the MDS is going to be looking for is to see if anything's missed. That, if there's one landscape that really lights up, and why isn't that receiving a priority?
So perhaps again we could use that information to refine what we me nominate if something like that then needs to be. I don't know. It just, I'm not quite understanding the point of the EM.
Well, there may be no point in the end. It's just one other tool that will be available in the end. And we may never use it, who knows, but it will be packaged so that we will.
Yeah, I'll just point out some of what we're doing is exploratory, okay? But some of what we're doing is also practical to fill in the gaps if we don't get nominations.
Yeah, sorry.
So many years ago, we did a huge monitoring on the margins effort,
Yeah.
and there was a lot of that data. I think the best thing that came out of the monitoring on the margins effort was the data call. We had lots of responses that were compiled into Willis, moving into High Five. Greg Donito has that, but really, I mean, seeing that data set that's in there and how accessible it is, I think is a better start, because we've already done the call for data and probably just need to be updated from what's missing in the last 5 or 6 years, because I think it was about 6 years ago that all happened, 6.5. So we have a great data set already available as call for datas go out, and a good standardized process for compiling that data. The other thing I think that is kind of missing on some of the insect and disease portions of this is that the pathologists and entomologists through FHP have done the risk map, and we have great data layers for situations like that and great models. So not recreating a risk model, but using stuff that the entomologists and pathologists through FHP have already spent a lot of time and effort and thought process into getting the best available stuff there. And then maybe it needs to be tweaked for whitebark pine. But we have a lot of those things out there already.
Tomorrow, there'll be, we're going to have breakout sessions, and hopefully there'll be a session on data. So please, it's a brain dump, come in and just tell us where all the data.
Yeah, we have a chance tomorrow for feedback and questions, and to also help. Remember, we're feeling our way. We've never done a whitebark pine restoration plan before, certainly not on this scale. And let me just supplement what you said. I was aware of the monitoring on the margins data from our regional conference calls, and Rob and I have been talking about the FHP data that's out there, and even the blister rust modeling data that has actually been done, and that should be incorporated as a layer as well, or into a layer, or at least compared with what we come up with to see if there's a difference, particularly using the, quote, Willis data and seeing what we have. So Thursday is a good opportunity for us to talk about it. The other thing that came out of the regional conference calls is the fact that with the call for data from Fish and Wildlife Service that happens every year, a lot of people have already compiled a lot of this information that would pertain directly to our call, and that's great. That's terrific. It means that they don't have to reinvent the wheel to get the data packages up and running. So. We've got more. Do we have time? One more question? Yes. Yeah.
I have a question. I was looking at the core areas, and one of the things that I don't see clearly, and maybe it was mentioned, but I just didn't click. Okay, so we developed these core areas. What is the long-term goal of those areas? In other words, when I think about restoring for the long term, I'm talking about hundreds of years in the future. So how do these core areas all fit together for the long-term restoration? When we all die and we're gone and nobody remembers, how are we going to leave the legacy for the continued expansion of whitebark pine over time? So one of the things that I don't see missing is what are the seed production areas that are going to be the expansion of whitebark restoration when we're not there? How does fire feel into that? How are we going to kind of think about how are these core areas going to help expand it into the future? And how are we going to integrate the disturbances to help that get there? And I don't see that in our core area scenario, a plan to really think about how these play as future seed sources, future expansion of the species and the communities.
Okay, well, the comment I made the other day, and it's in your best management practices document, in terms of time horizon, we, at this point in time, are simply thinking we have to get some restoration out there on the landscape, just by the seat of our pants survival of whitebark pine, particularly in many areas. But if we get these plantings maturing, and they need to be protected, they need to be monitored over time to look at their success, and we get mature cone-producing trees, the plan is natural in that nutcrackers, if we can keep them on the landscape and make sure they're backup seed sources. By the way, nutcrackers can't just live on whitebark pine. They have to have an alternate seed source to provide enough energy, and that would include Douglas fir, ponderosa pine, limber pine. Limber pine is in trouble too. We have to make sure our nutcrackers are going to be retained, and they will leave areas, and they are leaving areas, but they will come back if there are mature cone-producing trees. Their genetic population structure indicates they're highly mobile. And we've also seen from radio tracking that they can cover hundreds of miles even in the period of a week in their movements. So they're incredibly mobile. Nutcrackers are really key to this. They're key to whitebark, and they will do the dissemination out of the core areas into areas that have been burned, have large expanses of beetle kill. They are our hopes, to be honest with you, because we are not going to have the resources to plant the entire range or restore the entire range of whitebark pine. So we are really, I think we've reached a point, those of us particularly who work in the Northern Rockies and have seen the decline of whitebark, and we have non-functional ecosystems now in Glacier National Park, Flathead, even Lewis and Clark adjacent areas because of blister rust, and a history of mountain pine beetle kill. And we know that a non-functional whitebark pine community can happen. Those of you who have healthy forests, particularly those of you perhaps in Region 5, you don't quite understand what can happen. And we are sort of doing, I'll be blunt, sort of a rational, logical triage at this point in time. So we have to monitor what climate change is doing. We have to monitor what's happening with the severity of our wildfires into the future, and understand the threat to our restoration actions and what we've done. And then we are putting our hopes on our feathered friend to do the heavy lifting, basically. Okay, so I hope that helps. Mary, Francis has a question? Or?
Yes, but we built in some time today. This is important.
Okay. Yeah, Mary Francis.
In response to Terry's question, that was the whole point of doing the refugia analysis, is where do we have those healthy areas with the rust resistance and cold hardiness and drought tolerance that will be the seed source for the dissemination naturally over the long haul. So those are the areas that will have all the right stuff for that purpose.
Yeah, thank you, Mary Francis. And that underscores the importance of climate change mitigation, that we need to talk about that. It's not been something we've conversed about, but it's we do have some of that in the best management practices. And Bob and I just briefly had an exchange about it would be nice to do this kind of refugium modeling that you've done for the Inland West and other areas as well. So people might have an advanced idea of using that as part of their criteria, as you recommended yesterday after your talk. I think that is something we all really need to think about. You can see there's a lot of pieces to all of this, and it's a challenge to put all these pieces together. It's very complex, but we have to start somewhere on this thing. So thank you. Okay, and there'll be plenty. Yeah, Andy, go ahead.
So the modeled spatial products, this may be a question for Bob. The distribution, the blister rust hazard, the bark beetle hazard, climate change. I haven't seen models in the past, that because the Rocky Mountain and the Pacific Coast distributions are so different ecologically, climatically, almost in every way, it's hard to have one model that works well in both areas. So is there any consideration to having, kind of companion models, or models with different inputs and criteria that, so you get the best of both? Because I think it would be a disservice to have one model that, compromises in both places as opposed to maybe models with different inputs that, give you the best in both,
So are you talking about GCM models for climate change, or?
No, I've seen the models out of the Moscow lab where they modeled the current habitat for hundreds of different tree species, and I think it captured the Rocky Mountain distribution quite well. But when you got to the Pacific coast, it started to really fall off, and it didn't capture some areas it did, some areas it didn't, and things like that. So I guess that's my concern, is that if the models are parameterized for one particular area, it may not capture the other area.
So I can speak to that directly, is that the way to ensure that your area is going to be modeled correctly is to provide the data that the model will use for ground truth and so on. And so the reason that is, right, for whitebark is because the FIA grid wasn't dense enough to be able to capture whitebark. And so, yes, we can only go as far as the data, the field data will let us. But that's a good question, is that if there's any impetus to make sure all the layers are correct, please share your data.
Okay, plenty of time tomorrow. You can all think about questions for our workshop Thursday morning then. Thank you all. Those were great questions.
Yes.
Appreciate it.
Okay, let's keep it going. Melissa Jenkins is here to talk to us from the Flathead National Forest. They asked us some questions and think about how do you identify core areas? What are the priorities that we should consider?
I brought water this time. Still trying to get over that cold. Okay, so I was asked to talk about priority setting, so looking at the criteria that previous strategies have used and talk about how we could potentially use it for this effort. And I added a title here today. Oh, shoot, backwards. Oh, that went forward. Okay, press too hard. I'm on the board of directors of the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation also, so I'll also say become a member because you can be cool like the rest of us. Woo, woo. All right. So what am I going to do today? I'm going to talk about a brief overview of the prioritization principles used in the existing strategies. And Justin Heineke nicely put together that section of the presentation for me. He reviewed all the strategies. He's awesome. Then I'm going to talk about a summary of the prioritization criteria that was used in those strategies. And then I'm going to talk about some of the key questions we need to answer. And we've been talking about some of those. So can you all hear me in the back? Okay. So this is an integrative and adaptive process. We are building on each other. Started in 2008 with the Pacific Northwest strategy. Bob's range-wide would have been done sooner, but it took him 12 years. Then came the Greater Yellowstone Area strategy in 2011, which looked at the Pacific Northwest and improved on that. Then came out the range-wide strategy and gave us some real broad-scale information on how to move forward. And then the BLM strategy in 2016 built on the Greater Yellowstone and the national strategy and refined it even further. And here we are. We've got all this stuff to build on. So our strategy for the national strategy is going to be even better than all those. And there's also plans in development that are going to be using some of this information to help them get their strategies done. First one is the range-wide strategy that we're going to talk about. It's a strong reference document. It talks about whitebark status, their threats, and actions needed at 6 different scales. The entire range was equally important, regardless of land ownership and management policies. They didn't exclude wilderness right off the bat. The prioritization was focused on restoration need, not management direction and such. Grizzly bear habitat and blister rust levels were top priorities, perhaps because they were really applicable at the range-wide scale. And so here's the 6 different scales. We're going to talk about these a little bit more in depth later, but you can see range-wide where Canada falls off the map there for whitebark pine, but we know that's not true anymore. And then the regional scale, national park or forest scale, landscape scale, stand scale, all the way down to the tree scale. The next one we're going to talk about is the Pacific Northwest. This was the original one that was done. They had a focus on preserving genetic diversity at the ecoregional scale. Their populations are much more separated by space than a lot of the rest of the range, so they kind of looked at it differently, and they broke all of their areas into seed zones, and then within those seed zones, conservation areas. So they had 8 seed zones, 30 conservation areas, and then within each conservation area, they did something that Diana's talking about for maybe the national strategy, is that they identified, I think it was 2 things they want to do in each conservation area. But they looked at all of their whitebark. They didn't prioritize takeout, 20 or 30%. They gave grizzly bear habitat a top priority. They were missing a lot of information. You know, it was 2008 that this was published. So they used a lot of local expert knowledge. They did have information on recent fires, mountain pine beetle activity, and blister rust infection levels, so they did use that to prioritize, but they used a lot of local expert knowledge. So where they didn't have information, that was one of the things they prioritized, was doing surveys and getting more information. And they acknowledged, you know, they didn't prioritize, but they acknowledged that the funding and feasibility was going to be the limiting factor, so it was kind of going to prioritize for them. And they dropped wilderness out from the very beginning. We're going to talk about that too. Greater Yellowstone, their prioritization was driven by health and condition of whitebark communities. They had the Cadillac of information. Holy smokes. Thank you, Liz Davey and others. So they have a whitebark pine distribution map that's got cover type, size class, percent canopy cover, and they had a change detection map. So, you know, around here, blister rust has been killing trees for decades, right? And so the change has been slow and insidious, and we don't have satellite imagery from back in 1960 when it really started to impact things. They had satellite imagery before the mountain pine beetle outbreak. They didn't have much blister rust mortality. So they had change detection from 2000 to 2007 where they could say where most of their damage had occurred. So that was really, really helpful in their prioritization process. And so because they had all this great information, they had a really standardized and objective approach using that information. You guys are going to have to explain this to me, because when I read it, I didn't really see. Sometimes it would make sense and sometimes it wouldn't. But they had their protection and restoration actions prioritized separately, and I'm going to show you a little example of that. And they also used grizzly bear habitat, land ownership, access, and management policies to refine their prioritization. And they didn't completely drop wilderness out, but in effect they pretty much did, because they just said it was a low priority because of logistical challenges, which includes not just on the ground logistical challenges, but getting through the process. Then came the BLM, which was based on the Greater Yellowstone. It adapted the health and condition prioritization approach from the GYA strategy. They refined it even further. They included climate change more than the GYA strategy. They talked about distance from other whitebark stands, accessibility, also land management policies, past disturbance, T&E species habitat, and they, as the GYA, prioritized their protection and restoration actions separately. So my German brain, I was reading through all this stuff, and I was like, ooh, there's so many different options, right? I had to kind of compartmentalize it. And so these are things that I made up. There's no science behind this. It was just how I was thinking of it. So there may be some overlap, duplication, whatever, but I had to split it up somehow to explain it to you all. So here's the 7 categories that I split the criteria into for prioritization. First one is ecosystem services provided. So we need to prioritize areas that provide the most important ecosystem services. Watershed protection, we know that whitebark at high elevations stabilizes snowpack and regulates runoff. Are there municipal watersheds where we should be worrying about promoting whitebark pine? Grizzly bear habitat, that's a really common one used in almost all of the strategies. An ecosystem service that is important. And then tribal and First Nations cultural resources where they had traditional uses and spiritual sites. Should that be something we prioritize? Valuable assets. This is Mary Francis's, we got to protect Mary Francis's life legacy. So we have the genetic resources out there. Seed orchards, elite, especially elite trees, holy smokes. High genetic diversity areas, test plantations. We need to protect those areas. Whitebark pine plantations, right? Spent all that money planting them. Mature cone-producing trees and stands, so we have that legacy for the trees to reproduce. And also recreation sites with whitebark pine because they're great places where people can go and enjoy whitebark pine. Should we prioritize restoration or protection in there? Likelihood of success. This was mentioned earlier. Do we need to prioritize areas where restoration efforts are more likely to be successful over the long term? To Terry Jane's point. Whitebark pine likely to persist under future climate. Should we exclude areas that are pretty much low elevation and we don't think whitebark's going to do there in the long term? Proper aspect, topography and soils conducive to survival and growth and less competition from subalpine fir perhaps in the long term. We need to think about good distribution and connectivity. And then Mary Francis's point about genetic refugia, her research, is that a place that we should prioritize? Risk is another potential prioritization. So prioritize areas that have moderate to high risk of whitebark pine loss from mountain pine beetle. Do we have high hazard ratings there? The potential, whoa, did that go out? Yeah. Hello, on, says on. Technical difficulties, stand by. Test. Here we go. Crown fire potential, that's the thing that Bob was talking about with his MT whatever modeling that they did. Insufficient age class diversity, because we know that if all of our trees are mature, then we don't have comb production potentially in the future when all those trees get old, plus mountain pine beetle, et cetera, et cetera. Distance to seed source, 12 kilometers or more. Can nutcrackers get there? So should we focus on places that are kind of isolated so we don't lose them permanently? And we also know where there's low whitebark basal area, we know that nutcrackers aren't going to come there to forage. Oh dear. Sorry. And then where do we have existing losses? So we need to prioritize, this is like the main thing that everybody focused on, was prioritizing areas where whitebark pine has been lost. So where we've had our mountain pine beetle mortality, and where we've had blister rust mortality, or where we have high levels of blister rust infection, which we know is going to lead to mortality. Shade tolerant encroachment, so where we have a lot of succession going on. And then ongoing mountain pine beetle mortality, a lot of you know that you don't want to do a lot of treatments when you're, when you're having an ongoing outbreak, because you can actually exacerbate the problem. I like this one. This is the positive take, right? Opportunity. So prioritize areas where existing conditions are conducive to accomplishing restoration objectives. Let's plant our recently burned areas. Those are great spots with not a lot of competition. High elevation recreation sites, including ski areas, wow, what a great opportunity for education if we prioritize doing some restoration there. High blister rust mortality areas, we could promote regeneration opportunities there. Feasibility. This is kind of the downer of the other one. Prioritize areas that are the most efficient use of limited restoration resources. So they need to be a reasonable distance from a road or a trail. You know, we're not going to go to the top of these mountains probably, and so we need some at least moderate terrain to traverse. Is your NEPA complete? Is your burn plan complete? Is there funding available? Land management policies and ownership. Ownership kind of is the buzzword, the other word for wilderness. And so we need to think about those things. So that was kind of a summary of all the prioritization that I saw in the strategies. So here are some of the questions that I had, and some of you have been asking some of these questions. Well, number one, are there additional criteria that weren't considered, that we missed? About that. Should we incorporate scale into prioritization? I'm going to talk about that a little bit. You know, are we going to go down to the landscape scale? Are we going to go the stand scale? At what point are we going to do that? Should the criteria be weighted? And if so, would weights differ by different stakeholders? Should we leave feasibility criteria out until after all the other criteria have been evaluated? That option was brought up. Should we just look at really what's important to do on the ground and then say, okay, well, we can't do that because of access or wilderness designation or whatever. And so truly look at what the need is before we limit ourselves. Should protection and restoration actions be prioritized separately? The GYA and the BLM did that, and I'd like some discussion on that to see the value of that at the national strategy. Okay, so let's talk about criteria by spatial scale. This is the range-wide strategy example. So, for example, range-wide, Bob talked about grizzly bear habitat and percent blister rust infection. Those are really broad. Remember Diana's map with the big of high levels of rust versus low levels of rust. And then at the regional level, we could talk about things like mountain pine beetle mortality and crown fire potential. At the forest level, you're getting little finer scale, talk about age class distribution, connectivity, losses from fire. Landscape scale, that's kind of like where you really get into the meat, talk about grizzly bear habitat needs, change from ARV, your action, and what planning stage you're in. Is your NEPA done? That kind of thing. Then at the stand, you're going to talk about things like access, mountain pine beetle hazard of that stand, the successional status, how much basal area of whitebark is. That's really important for grizzly bear and nutcrackers, and the distance of that stand to seed source. And then when you get down to the tree, you can look at individual comb production and blister rust resistance. So is this the scale that we're going to look at for when we're doing our core area prioritization? Or, you know, at what point are we going to get to the stand scale? Because that's where you actually have to decide where you're going to do your work. I'm not sure. I should have presentation with the fact that, believe it or not, the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation, American Forest, and the Washington office don't have all the answers of how we're going to do this. And that is why you guys are here. That's why they invited you, okay? So pay close attention, because your test is how much you're going to contribute tomorrow to this discussion. We have to decide these things, or at least talk about the options. Should the criteria be weighted by importance? And would the weights differ by stakeholder? So here are some examples of what could be in a core area prioritization. So you got grizzly bear habitat, percent blister rust infection, the presence of high value assets, mountain pine beetle mortality levels, loss from stand replacing fire, future climate adaptability, age class distribution. And depending on the stakeholder, or maybe we would have consistent weights, but we could weight how important each one of those is.
And then you have to define your criteria, what that means. What does grizzly bear habitat mean? Would core area be different than security area weight? Blister rust infection, what's high, what's medium, what's low? Let's see. Stam replacement fire, did you have a big, huge fire, little fire? And your age class distribution, you know, is it mostly mature or is it partially mature? So you could put a rating scale in there also, and then have a score, and that, you know, and then compare the scores. That's just one way of doing it. Should we leave feasibility criteria out until after all the other criteria have been evaluated? I kind of talked about that a little bit, but we need to think about that. Should we just prioritize everything by really what the needs are and then put this feasibility reality check? Or should that, are we wasting our time? Should we put that on up front? Should protection and restoration actions be prioritized separately? This is from the BLM strategy. I just threw it up so you guys could see what I'm talking about. So here are some individual, the section or the topic is stand damage. So no current mountain pine beetle activity. It gets a protection score of 5 and a restoration score of 0, whereas let's see, high epidemic levels of mountain pine beetle get a 0 protection and a high restore. And then you have a different weight. I guess this would be by stand, they're looking at it, by stand. And then at the bottom, each stand has a score for protection versus restoration. So not that that wasn't enough questions. We had some other questions, and some of these were brought up also. Is this strictly a bottom-up effort, or should we establish regional agency priorities to inform the core area prioritization effort? That's stuff that Diana was talking about. We've kind of fleshed out in the past 24 hours. Somewhat answers this question that yes, we probably should have some regional direction or higher level direction when we're talking about what our priorities should be. But that's open to we don't have a definite answer on that. And then this is another one, Carol McKenzie brought this up to me yesterday, is the unit scale the appropriate level to do your prioritization? And if so, okay, so that's a question, is that appropriate? So the Greater Yellowstone, yes, they have their prioritization, but it doesn't have core areas established. So when they're going in to establish their core areas, should they be thinking of that together as the Greater Yellowstone area, or should they be thinking of it as the Forest Service Region 1 direction? They also have Region 4, and then Park Service and et cetera, you know, or should their prioritization, all of their core areas, all have the same criteria? I don't know. Could do that. Could have all the units within the GYA have the same criteria, and that may solve the problem. They'd also have to have the same definitions of what the criteria are. And then the last one here, should we minimize the number, and after, this is me, after looking at all these criteria, thinking, wow, maybe we should just simplify this, right? And kind of minimize the number of criteria we consider to simplify the process, because we have to have data to be able to use the criteria, right? We can't prioritize criteria if we don't have data. So maybe we should look at the data that we have and then say, okay, well, out of those data, these are the criteria we can use. I don't know. Okay. And I'm finishing up with one of my favorite quotes. The true meaning of life is to plant trees under whose shade you do not plan to sit. Which means, for all of us that plant whitebark pine, we know the true meaning of life. Okay, that's it. Questions? Yes, Sean.
Thanks, Melissa. That was awesome. I just had a couple comments. Can you, I think it was the feasibility or likelihood of success slide when you had basal area, back a bit. More. I think maybe one for this. More. Right there, last point. I just wanted to point out that's 1,000 cones per hectare, not acres, so
Look at
big.
me, I did my little US, okay. Based on Sean's research is where that comes from. Sorry. Okay.
Pyramid that would, at the bottom had the stand and tree, where the base, yeah. I would just offer that also cone production is important, probably functionally at the stand, perhaps mostly the landscape, but hard to measure level because you're thinking about nutcrackers there.
Definitely.
As Diana was pointing out, right, the future goal is to have these systems functioning again, and you know the northern divide being a heuristic for what happens when things break down. So the birds are not, you know, you could have a tree with copious cone production isolated and 90% mortality stand, and we've all seen that, and those seeds literally die on the vine. They're not harvested at all by birds.
Spoken like a true nutcracker researcher. I think this was not an exclusive list, but you know, basal area, whitebark pine kind of gets at that. But yes, definitely, it's a stand level consideration. Yep. Yep. Good point.
Going to your points for prioritization, I don't know how many people here in the room are familiar with it, and I'm by no means an expert, but this is ripe for, and I would strongly recommend for those of you who are actually at the decision-making table for prioritization to consider or at least look into structured decision-making. In my experience, it's vastly superior to all other decision-making processes for many reasons that I'd be happy to talk about later if you were interested.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, Melissa, just a quick comment. Blister rust infection levels do vary considerably across the range of whitebark pine, as we saw yesterday. So I would just recommend that that percent blister rust infection be moved down to a lower scale, probably a regional scale.
Yes. Again, this was just out of the range-wide strategy, and it was an example of how you could look at things, but they could certainly be moved up or down a couple of scales depending on. Is not how to do it. These are examples of how different scales how you can look at things at different scales. Yeah.
I just would like to offer a suggestion that when we talk about prioritization and implementation, that we actually separate the scales we're thinking of. So while we tend to do any implementation restoration as a stand scale, maybe at the mini landscape, but not at a larger scale.
You're going to be done before I get here.
Yes. I was offering to separate our scale considerations between when we prioritize for landscape. For landscapes?
Just keep talking.
Okay. Or whether we think about implementation is definitely a smaller scale activity, while the prioritization very well can happen at a larger scale. So think about prioritizing for landscapes, but yes, we don't restore a landscape with one implementation action.
Oh, no, I didn't figure it out. Never mind. Okay, any other questions? Yeah, Rob.
Great presentation. I guess some of the comments have made me think having a purpose statement for this document would be helpful. And I just got here and wrote one. To guide restoration efforts in a harmonized way across land ownerships in a way that conserves and preserves whitebark so it remains as a keystone foundation species. The point being, I think we need one because questions have come up. Is this a selling document? Is this a guiding document? What's the true purpose? And that would help explain this. And then another point is I'm thinking if things are this dire, and this is like the condor bird, they're worried about a genetic conservation strategy to preserve that bird. And that, to me, genetics, not because I'm a geneticist, but should be a layer somewhere, because marginal populations may have rare alleles that are really important. And if things are that dire, we're just trying to save this thing from blinking out. A lot of these other things are stretch goals that may not get to, and we want to keep the species alive, and there should be some genetic component, especially if technology advances so that we identify molecular techniques that identify rust resistance and can be real metrics that you use when you go out on a landscape and say, oh, that has the right gene, we better save that stand, or that tree. So some kind of genetic component filter, I think, would add to it, and a clear statement of purpose. Thanks.
Good comments. Thank you.
I can just hold on
You
to
can
this
hold-
if you want.
No, give that back to me. I know you, Rob Mangold. Okay. Any other questions?
Build on Sean's comment on the tree level with the rust resistance should be bumped up to the stand level. Good point.
So I think we've learned a lot from the Western pine system, and we know in high rust hazard sites not to plant Western white pine back into those sites. So it's a little concerning to me in prioritizing areas and putting limited resources into areas that we know have 50, 60, 80, 90% blister rust infection rate, because I don't think that planting in those with high blister rust pressure is going to be successful. So talking about this prioritization process and really looking at what, with limited funding, we're doing, and learning from other systems where we're saying, hey, this isn't the best place to put Western white pine, we know to step away from those sites. And I know it's hard to let go of that when you see high rust sites with whitebark pine, but we do have to really think about what we're putting these resistant individuals back out into, and prioritizing those sites too. So thinking about that as we're doing our surveys and where we'll be successful with restoration strategies is important. And I agree with Diana, bringing that blister rust infection down a lot lower, because we see huge stand differences just in short differences in what the blister rust infection rates are, because those environmental factors for blister rust are really, really finite, and it's hard to even get good rust hazard maps. We don't have it for even Western white pine, unfortunately. So those stand level for blister rust, and also realizing that we need to think about the best bang for our buck, where we can actually put our improved stock back out there and give it a chance of surviving.
Well said. Yeah, Diana.
Thanks.
Thanks. Sounds like Finding Nemo a little bit, or Finding Dory. Anyhow, yeah, some of us still watch those movies. If you have kids too. Just dovetail that comment. Rich Sinesco. Rich, are you here? Great. He and I have talked about the fact recently to be nice if we could actually model rust hazard. This is a concept that seems to have kind of dropped off the face of the earth, but the Western white pine were very involved in. Okay, that's a bad one.
Yeah.
All right, let's see how long this one lasts. We're very involved in developing hazard models and trying to apply them to the wide landscape. And the fact is, even where we have really high blister rust infection rates, there are remarkably interspersed stands that aren't as infected. And we're struggling to understand all the factors that create that. But this is maybe an academic exercise, but going back to this hazard modeling is very helpful. And this is why I keep talking about bet hedging, in that, just from an emotional standpoint, a lot of us feel that we'd like to go into the most heavily impacted stands and do something. And we're hoping that our rust resistance will hold up. And this is why the field trials are so important, and the field trials actually should be out there in the high hazard areas, so we actually know if that resistance is going to be durable. But this idea of also looking at rust hazard and how it varies on the landscape might be useful for targeting your restoration. So, point very well taken. Thank you.
Those are great points, and I think they're going to be great points of discussion tomorrow when we're talking about what prioritization criteria we should use. And just know that this is from the range-wide strategy. They were just throwing things out at the time. It's outdated, and we are not suggesting that we use this scale. It was just to show you that we should be considering things at different scales, and so you can start thinking about where does the core area prioritization, at what scale should we be looking at that? And then is there a scale below it then that we're going to have to look at in addition to that to talk about where we're actually going to go and do the work on the ground? Okay, any other questions before break? No pressure. Okay?
Great, thank you. Let's take a break and come back at 10:30. Okay, so great session this morning on the plan and priority process. Good food for thought to keep talking about today on the field trip. If you're getting cold, just huddle up and keep talking about priority criteria. Today we're going to talk about one more thing to consider through the planning process. There are a host of other issues to think through. How do we know if we're being successful? How do we begin to think about costs for this effort? As we develop priority areas, how do we communicate what that's going to cost to implement those actions? And of course, adaptive strategy too, moving forward as new information comes in. Ellen and Diane are on. Thank you.
I sat up closer today, so I didn't have to run from the back and set the pace for the conversation. I'll go a little slower today. I had a few of those comments. One of the things Diana and I were talking about as we're prepping this presentation is that on the agenda it says other plan elements. And that includes the measures of success, the cost estimates, and adaptive management. We'd like to think of this as investing in our restoration other than other plan elements. This is a big point. Is there the clicker? Just a key point just to start off. This is a big investment. So today we're going to start off talking about some cost estimates. And as I like to say, this might be sticker shock for those of you that haven't been in the implementation of whitebark pine restoration. So we want to kind of display what some of those costs are. We'll talk about measures of success and monitoring, adaptive management strategy, and then coordination and tracking. So I'll start off with the cost estimates, and Diana will be hitting those last three topics. So when we first start looking at cost estimation, we just talked about the core areas. We want to make sure that people understand that those core areas could be quite large. So your level of investment could be very large. But again, the question of scale comes in. When we actually implement, we're going to be implementing at the stand scale. And I think Diana mentioned that earlier. So, the cost per an individual unit may be high, but that may be relative to, a larger landscape. And so part of this goal is to provide the greatest return for this investment. What we talked about, the likelihood of success, the feasibility. We want to make sure that we're putting this investment in places that we know will work. We have a good way to monitor it. And if we're not doing something right or something's not going quite the way we expected, then we can adapt to that. And so we're also going to tear off a little bit on the management practices document that Bob had presented yesterday. So that'll be kind of, those main categories that are in that document will be kind of the impetus for some of the costs that we'll talk about. But first, I want to take a step back and give a little bit of an example from the GYA. I think it was Brian and Eric and Gary that talked a little bit about the multiple funding sources that are used. And before we get to the sticker shock piece, I wanted to kind of present how we kind of react to some of these things in the GYA and how we use these multiple funding sources to get restoration done on the ground. Kind of alluded to a little bit to it yesterday. So specifically, I want to talk a little bit specifically about some of those funding sources that we use annually. Not all of them are used annually, but we petition for these things annually so that we can get pieces of our restoration plan done over time. So one of the ones that we have that's really specific to the Greater Yellowstone area is the Greater Yellowstone Coordinating Committee uses a base set of funding from all the agencies. So there's $250,000 that comes off the top from the Department of Interior and Department of Agriculture through the respective agencies that feeds into this funding source. So $215,000 comes from the Forest Service, and then $35,000 from the Department of Interior, which would be the BLM and the Park Service. Fish and Wildlife Service lands within the GYA. One of those Fish and Wildlife Service properties has a minor component of whitebark pine, so the refuges really don't contribute to this, if I understand it right. Where's David? Is that correct? Okay. So, but that $250,000 is spread amongst the 11 subcommittees, not just whitebark pine. So you can see overall this becomes a very small funding source when you're looking at the 11 subcommittees, and they're all putting in projects for this funding. So this, it sounds like it's huge, but that's a whitebark pine plus 10. So, so there's several other emphasis areas that come in here. And these are appropriated dollars that are competed for amongst the subcommittees. And then if there are other partners that want to come in, they have to partner with one of the subcommittees in order to submit for this funding. So this is pretty specific to the GYA. Then the next big one that we use every year, as Gary talked about yesterday, was the whitebark pine forest health protection restoration proposals. And I think most of the folks in this room who have implemented this may have submitted projects here. And if Gary's in here, I think it's a base funding of $100,000 to $3,000 annually. Is that correct, roughly? Good ballpark? It varies. On the lower end? Yeah. Okay, about $100,000 annually. And this is open to the states, the NGOs, universities, tribal, federal agencies, and non-federal partners need to show the cost share requirements. Correct? Am I correct on that? Okay. One of the other things that we use pretty heavily, and I think Brian touched on this, it's a little less heavily than I thought from the data that he presented, is that it was 8% of the reforestation partnership proposals that are through the National Forest Service, Washington office with the partners, American Forest, National Forest Foundation, Planetary, and some of those others. So that was a little less than I expected because maybe with our leveraging and the GYA that we get a higher proportion. I think in our case it might be a little bit higher. The other one, the regular forest health protection proposals that deal with the insect and disease suppression and restoration, we use those pretty exclusively and focus those proposals towards those very specific protection measures such as the carbaryl spraying, the verbenone pouches, because the whitebark pine restoration proposals really wanted to segregate those out. So we became very strategic in how we put those proposals in. And then the 5-needle pine genetic conservation funds that Gary talked about yesterday too, that's specific for limber, whitebark, bristlecone, and other foxtails. Did I miss one? Is that correct? Oh, it does. Okay, so it competes with other species as well. Okay, so thank you. And then each of the agencies also uses these funding sources that we just talked about to use other local ones that may be available on a very small scale. I'll give one example for the Shoshone in Region 2. These are more specific to Colorado, and Jeff Underhill, our regional silviculturalist, clued me into this, that Tree Cycler uses partners with major corporations, and so they have barcodes on their products that you can use to go to their website and say, I want to help a planning project on this agency, on this forest in Region 2. And so this is one case where we expanded that and put in a proposal for cone collection throughout the GYA. So we actually have, this is new, this has only been in existence a year, and I don't know much more detail about it, but this is just an example of some other local opportunities that we can grab onto. So those are kind of our, and then some other ones that Brian talked about yesterday, like the RAC funding we've also used. There's some other ones that pop in there. So we have learned to become very creative, and timing is very important. Most of these funding sources, with the exception of like the local sources, are basically on the federal fiscal year schedule. So basically these calls for proposals are coming out usually early in the fiscal year. Except for the GYCC, which is earlier the previous fiscal year, so it gives us a little bit more time. So it's mostly on a fiscal year basis, because most of them are appropriated dollars. But they're very key with all these to piece together some of these cost estimates. These last two proposals are a little bit more complex, the geospatial technologies and the special project proposals. We have submitted, as part of the GYCC and the Greater Yellowstone Monitoring Network, has submitted some proposals in that evaluation monitoring criteria for some of the long-term monitoring that we've been doing. So these we don't use as often, but just know that they are out there as opportunities. So, before we quite get down to the sticker shock level, I'm going to transition back into what the costs actually are. So yesterday there was Bob and Diana were talking about the spreadsheet that's been going around, and they said they would, follow up and try and accumulate some more costs. So some of that's already happened. So we've tried to build some of the cost estimates that we knew were out there. We looked at this last year's, I think it was this last year's Whitebark Pine restoration proposals, because that kind of caught more range-wide activities that were being done, so we could try and build some, I won't say average, let's say we could build a range of costs, because averages don't really work when you're talking about whitebark, I think. And then I made some additional contacts with the nurseries, with some research folks and other agencies, just to try and piece some of these together. Now the caveats is that this isn't complete, we're just starting it, so the costs that I'll present, you might find that they may not fit for your area. That may be because we don't have data for your area yet, so it's really important to get this stuff back, so for the national plan we can have a comprehensive range that's represented. And so again, when that call comes out, please do provide that input back, so this will be a more complete picture in the strategy. Now, one of the things I want to talk about before we get into the sticker shock again is that there's going to be a lot of variation in these prices. And that depends on a lot of different factors, some of which we've talked about already. So the first thing I think of is the GYA. We're kind of way out there. As an example, most of the tree climbing contractors that we use, I only know of one that's local in Jackson, close to us, and so their prices are fairly reasonable. Most of them come out of the Northwest, western Montana and west. Same thing with most of the planting contractors will come out of the Pacific Northwest. So when you're talking about where you're at in relation to these contractors makes a big difference on their mobilization to get to you. And you know what, I mean, any of you that's planted know that the weather's going to change the day before you plant. And so you're going to have to regroup with those contractors and adjust schedules and based on all the other projects that they have. So that's a big factor in that price fluctuation. Another thing is the expertise that resides within the agency. It depends on which agency you're with, which unit that you're on, depends on, are you a specialist or a generalist? I've worked on the extreme forest. I've worked on one forest where I was a specialist, and now you're a generalist. So you're doing a lot of different jobs. You're doing the best you can to get it done. And so your costs coming through and the availability of the people that you have to do the work may vary. So if you're a generalist, we tend to contract more or coordinate more, like we do within the GYA. If you're more of a specialist force and you have the budget or a specialist unit, that may make a difference on how much you can train your own people to do the jobs. And some of the costs that we looked at, some of them, especially if you're getting into some trials or some research costs, those costs will tend to be higher because they're very specific to a certain outcome. So those costs might be much more variable and much higher in some cases. And Brian talked yesterday about stewardship opportunities and whether you have commercial material available that if you're doing a patch clear cut to create a nutcracker opening, if you can sell that volume commercially or not, will give you some return. It may or may not happen depending on where you're working and the accessibility. So you may have to do these as service contracts versus a timber sale contract per se. And then just the location of the treatment itself, depending on what you're doing. The accessibility is an issue. We talked a lot about that yesterday. The size, if you're doing a small area, you're going to have a much higher cost per unit. The type of treatment, the feasibility of the treatment, like we talked about this morning, and if it's a multiple or repetitive treatment, all these things come into play. So when you see these ranges of costs, keep these kinds of things in mind because there is no law of average. So you ready for the sticker shock now? Okay. Okay, so again, I'm going to go back to that best management practices document that Bob presented yesterday and kind of break some of these treatments into categories following that document. So for genetic restoration, we're looking at plus tree identification of about $500 a tree, resistance screening, $1,200 a family, scion and pollen procurement, $200 per tree or collection. The rootstock grafting ranges from about $10 to $14 a tree, and when I talked to the nursery, they were saying that some of this variability depends on how much mortality they even get in the nursery, so the higher the cost, the more mortality that they have. On the rest of the stuff, as far as the seed orchards and the clone banks, there's only 4 whitebark pine seed orchards that I know of. There may be others. And I was only able to garner some costs from one of them. So know that these, if Mary Frances is still here, she kind of gave me the caveat that some of these may be off, and I don't know how they're going to change. And some I couldn't quite piece together yet. So the seed orchard establishment and the seed orchard maintenance were $7,000 to $8,000 per acre. So the next group of treatments is basically some thinning or regeneration cuts. And if you're talking about pure thinning or TSI, you're looking at $600 to $1,300 an acre. Selections very similar. The weeding and cleaning or the daylighting can vary. It could be very low or it could be very high. It depends on how much slash that you're treating and how much you have to pull away from those whitebark trees. So the lower the cost, the less fuels I think you have to deal with afterwards. A lot of these higher costs are assuming that you're doing some sort of piling or doing a lot of slash management as well. And as far as the nutcracker openings or patch or stand level clear cuts, with or without reserves, $700 to $1,600 an acre. Some of the fire and fire protection treatments that we have for fuel augmentation, which would be if you're trying to get a desired outcome on your burn prescription, you're treating the understory fuels to achieve a certain objective. That runs about $85 per tree. Fuel removal, $20 per tree. Pruning, $10 per tree. And prescribed burning, whether you're trying to achieve the low to a high severity replication, would be $1,200 to $2,000 an acre. And then when you get into suppression, you know, if you have to save some individual trees, a retardant drop, you know how much aircraft costs. So you're looking at $17,000 per drop. And fuel manipulation about $25 a tree. Reforestation operations. These, I think, we've been doing enough planting over here that these are probably a little bit more standardized costs. With the exception of cone collection, when I looked at the range of prices at $159 to $1,100 per tree, that's a pretty big range. I think there were a couple of outliers that pulled that range out, but when I kind of looked at I want to say average, but a little better range, it was generally about $350 to about $850 per tree, I think is more of an appropriate range. And again, I think the low end cost, somebody must have had a contractor or their own climber sitting right there, you know, in their town. But I think that average, and then if you want to correlate to that per bushel, is $79 to $559 per bushel. Growing the seedlings would cost anywhere from about $2.18 to $2.35 per tree. And that includes all your sow and grow and delivery costs. And then planting can vary a little bit depending on how you implement it again, you know, whether you're using contract or force account. Generally, we have about 71 cents to $1.27 per tree. And in some cases, since we're trying to microsite as best we can, we plant per thousand, and those costs can range $350 to $900. The higher end costs are for larger containers, and if you're auger planting, those are some of our higher end costs. Hoded planting is generally down on the lower end of that range. And then averaging, you know, maybe $150 to $500 an acre if you're planting on a per acre basis. Direct seeding, there have been a few studies with direct seeding, and so those costs are about $200 an acre or $224 a tree. And when we start talking about protective treatments, the verbenone patches are generally about $250 an acre or $30 per tree. So that's where you're going out and protecting your elite trees. Carbaryl spraying can range about $700 an acre or $145 to $160 per tree. And then splat verbenone is about $160 an acre. And then treatment and monitoring. For any type of plus tree, field trial survivals, thinning, and patch and stand clear cuts, it's a little bit easier instead of putting this on a per acre basis because your treatments could be very large or small. Tried to put it on a per day depending on what the salary level was of the people that were going out. So we tried to put it on a per day basis. So we're looking at about $130 to $400 per day. Prescribed buyers $200 an acre, and then oh, not 900. I have a typo in there. Sorry. Survival surveys don't cost $200 or $900 an acre. It's $9 to $15 an acre. Sorry about that. And then long-term monitoring or research monitoring. This is where this is really the apples to oranges because every research project and every design, sampling design, is going to be very different. So I just pulled 3 examples that we had from the restoration proposals this last year and some of the things we do in the GYA. Our blister rust monitoring transects are about $1,200. And Kristen, where are you, Kristen? So Kristen, you said the lower end of that range would be more for your repeat measures, and then the establishment was closer to $1,500 a transect, correct? Correct, okay. And then some natural recovery surveys that Diana's been working on averaged about $315 a plot. And then there's been some long-term plantation survival research that's about $23 an acre. So, I mean, those are going to be apples to oranges. This is just giving you some of the ideas of what monitoring could add up to. So, after all that sticker shock and what the costs of this really are, so then we want to kind of talk about, we'll switch over to Diana, and she'll talk about the measures of success and adaptive managing to make sure that our investment is well protected.
Thanks, Ellen. Don't tell my graduate students about the $315 per plot. Okay, it's really important during the restoration implementation process that we have measurable goals for the restoration actions that we apply. We need objective ways to assess progress and to measure success of these actions that are implemented. If our set goals aren't achieved, the restoration project may need to be revisited, supplemented, maybe a second planting attempt, for example, or a different approach. So we know that this is an art. It's not a science, really, in terms of restoration. So all conservation and restoration actions that are implemented need to have associated measures of success. So here's a couple of examples. A timeline goal, for example, seedling planting, there could be a target number, say a time frame of 5 years, 10 years, in terms of how many acres are actually planted. And then it's really important that the unit evaluate what they've actually accomplished against what their goals might be. So part of nominating the core areas and identifying restoration treatments has to be starting to set some goals for yourself and some timelines as well. Another example would be a measure of success. Say you do a planting and you need to go back out and survey and monitor to see what your survival is. 1 year survival, or it might be a 3 year, and then you need to come back at 5 year to see how things are going. Another example might be a timeline. You may set a goal, time goal in terms of plus tree identification. This is really important because the plus trees and getting them screened are really at the heart of operational seed collections and planting. So you need to make sure that genetic resistance is really high on your list of restoration actions. You might have a goal of how many plus trees you need in your unit to contribute to perhaps a seed zone and the total. And that might be a 5-year timeline. It could be a 10-year timeline. And then a measure of success regarding plus tree identification would be after the screening process. You can identify plus trees, but that doesn't mean they have genetic resistance. It takes the screening process in order to elicit that. And you could have a target on the number of actual elite trees. Those are the trees that are actually shown to have genetic resistance from a screening process. Found per seed zone versus target number. The measurement of success, obviously, is we've just talked about, depends on having monitoring time frames and a monitoring plan. And so it's really important that when restoration actions are identified, there is some thought given to how are you going to go out and ensure success. So for example, for many restoration actions such as silviculture thinning, prescribed fire, planting, sowing, field trials for durability of genetic resistance and others, you actually need to go out and monitor, because some of these could have mixed results. And you actually need to look at these results before you do additional work in that particular area. I'll talk about that in just a moment. That pertains to adaptive management. All these different actions really need some sort of protocol for evaluation over what should be a reasonable time frame, so that you can use this information for future work. Then if measures of success are not met, you may have to go out and rethink what you're going to do. You may need to supplement, for example. Maybe the density of seedlings put out versus mortality needs to be reevaluated, and you need a higher density of seedlings in a particular area in order to get maybe a target stand density, survival density. It's really critical to determine the reasons, or to use your best guess as to why you're not meeting your goals, and that's part of the adaptive management perspective on this. So just as a refresher about adaptive management, it's based on adjusting your management practices over time to adjust goals or restoration outcome trajectories. Okay, so it's based on obviously monitoring results, evaluating whether target goals are met or not, and using the results from the field to inform your strategy, inform your protocol to adjust or correct what you're doing. So basically, with adaptive management, you may start out with a plan or a design, so a restoration plan, for example. You implement that plan. You then do your assessment and monitoring in the appropriate time frame, and you have to make a decision whether or not your goals were met. And if they're not met, you have to then incorporate that into evaluation and decision making about repeating that kind of restoration action. And also you need to figure out whether you need to revisit what you did and whether something needs to be tweaked out there. Replanted, you may need to do a second wave of silvicultural thinning just to make sure that the outcome is what you want. Most of us know about adaptive management, but it's very appropriate for restoration. All right, so the point is we have restoration protocols. They've been successfully applied to certain geographic areas and community types. Certainly folks in the GYA have a good track record and a history. They know what works and doesn't work. The problem is we're now sort of pushing the envelope and venturing into new geographic areas and advocating that we step up this restoration for other areas. And there's a lot of uncertainties. Working out the kinks may take some trial and error to fine-tune, say, planting protocols, for example. So planting protocols are are a challenge. We have them for the Northern Rockies, and that's what Glenda Scott, Ward McCoy, and Kay Isler put together at one point, but they're not applicable across the range. And as we talked about at our recent Jasper meeting of the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundations, and there's a WPF Canada as well, so we met jointly with them. A lot of those protocols don't work up north, and they don't work probably in areas that differ climatically. So we've got to actually do a little bit of trial and error and be willing to accept not meeting your goals all the time. So these adaptive management strategies or processes apply to protocols in terms of fine-tuning or adjusting over time. And we are definitely still learning how we are doing things. All right, getting back to the National Whitebark Pine Restoration Plan, circling back to this, once the plan is launched, we can't just turn our backs and say, it's up to you guys. We really need to have some assessment of progress over time at a higher level to see what is happening to whitebark pine over time. And I'm going to stick my neck out here and say that we really need to have some sort of coordinator of the National Whitebark Pine Restoration Plan, or maybe of all the 5-needled white pines, a high-level coordinator to assess annual progress in terms of where we're at. And even better, it would be great if this person could work across agencies, sort of like the interagency grizzly bear team that was so successful for a long time. And someone who could gather information from the various jurisdictions and track what's happening and what the success is. For progress, we realize that we're going to be dependent on available resources. So the problem is, it's not just your deal, it's how you get supported, okay? And we've talked about the different avenues for that support. So the funding, you guys can't do things without resources, and we've really got to strategize about getting those resources to you, and you taking advantage of what is out there and available as well, which you've heard about in the last few days. So some final points here. With respect to restoring whitebark pine, a restoration plan is not enough. The most detailed blueprint does not equal a building being built. And I can't stress this more. We may put together the most detailed restoration plan. Everyone complies. We've got a beautiful prioritized restoration plan. But that doesn't make whitebark restored. And that needs to be, internalized by all of us sitting here. It's only by using that plan and implementing that plan with on-the-ground restoration that we will be restoring whitebark pine. So progress needs to be made on implementation, and it needs to be made at a reasonable pace, because just a little bit at a time is not going to counteract the rate of losses that whitebark pine is experiencing. So this is as much a major point about, okay, once we get a plan and we've shared the plan and it's been reviewed and we feel good about the plan, we really do need to figure out a way at the highest level to monitor progress on the plan. So obviously monitoring needs to occur at multiple levels here in order for us to be successful. Okay. Anyhow, I think that's all I have to say, and I know people are really anxious about lunch and the field trip, and I think we'd all like to get out of these away from these walls for a little bit, so being outdoors will be terrific. Eric, did you want to say anything here?
For Eleanor, Diana? Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I'm wondering what if, and maybe this is more of a topic for tomorrow's discussions, but I think this is really important. This is kind of my focus, is thinking about how can we absorb information from the restoration work that we do and then use that to inform, and how can we do that effectively. And I think that one of the big things that's missing in a lot of restoration activities is that the way that we implement the plans on the ground really affects the amount of information and the quality of information that we can then pull from that. And I know that in an implementation framework, we're specifically not trying to do research, but we can use a lot of lessons from experimental design and research to better do adaptive management. And I'm wondering if we're thinking about that.
I think that you raise a really good point. And actually, this has been a problem forever. In terms of not having the research dollars to do things in a certain way. And we don't want to add that onus to what you guys are doing. Maybe that's why a well thought out monitoring strategy is really important, because we can understand through GIS and even through PRISM data what the local climate is and what your conditions are out on the field. And if people can take the time during a visit to really try to figure out, well, this is a more exposed site. This one appears to have been more sheltered. These kinds of information are really important. Obviously, with these best management practices, I see a time frame of 5-10 years where we come back and revise them, because we should know a lot more about geographic variation in what we're doing and how to do things better. Each region, just using region of the Forest Service in just a geographic sense, actually should be developing or fine-tuning all these protocols for what works there. Okay, so again, this whole thing can't be regarded as a one-off. It has to evolve, and this adaptive management strategy that we're talking about not only has to be at the unit implementation level, but it has to be at the higher integrated level as well. And I did express my concern to some folks that, well, I'm not going to be in the whitebark pine business forever. I may be writing books somewhere. And Eric may end up, directing nonprofits somewhere else or whatever over time. And we need people to fill in and pick this up. And we need to have some sort of mechanism for continuity over time. This can't be just this 5 years project flavor of the month, so to speak. Once it's done, there's got to be some durability built into this plan and oversight. So we need to raise these issues and have these conversations. So totally agree with you. Okay, I've probably talked enough for the 2 days, and Eric? Yep, thank you.
And a note too, we'll post all these presentations on a website. I'll be in touch about how you can find those. Like Ellen's got loads of great data on her website. Want to make sure you can access that after we leave here. A note on the agenda, we've got some time built in for networking. I think it's one of the best benefits of getting together workshops like this. So we got a little time here, lunch at 11:30 right behind us. And then I think Linda's driving one of these buses, and she says she's leaving at 1. So you better be on the bus. 12:45, the buses will be outside. We're not sure if they're right here out front, so just keep an eye out for those. I'll try to help you out as I learn more. And then we'll leave at 1, and we'll be off to the field trip. Thanks.